Hello, dear ones. Father Peter John coming to you from All Saints Orthodox Church in Bloomington, Indiana. Christ is risen. I want to talk today about a saint that we celebrate this week and then close with a story that is a little bit more contemporary. I'm talking about Saint Symeon the Stylite, and he's called Saint Symeon the Younger. I'll explain why. So Saint Symeon was a very, very devout child, and the report is that he was raised partly with the direction of St. John the Baptist. He didn't live at the same time as St. John the Baptist. He just had a prayerful relationship with St. John the Baptist. And so at a very early age, probably around 8 or 9 years old, he went to live at the monastery, became a monastic. By the age of 12, he was desiring to emulate his namesake, Saint Symeon the theologian, Saint Symeon the Stylite, by living on a pillar. And so the monks, even though they knew that he was a spiritual giant, they were a little nervous about this 12-year-old living on a pillar. So they gave him a smaller pillar. It was a pillar, but it was a smaller pillar. It wasn't like, 2-3 stories high. And so he lived on this pillar for 10 years. At the end of that 10-year period, he went to a place called Wondrous Mountain. Now, I've tried so hard to figure out where Wondrous Mountain came from, and in my reading, all I can come up with is that this was just a mountain in present-day Turkey. It says that it was a dry and rocky place, and that he went and he lived there on Wondrous Mountain in this dry and rocky place, and that it became known as Wondrous Mountain because of Saint Symeon. That's what I can figure out, I guess. And I'll get to that in a minute. Because after he lived on that dry and rocky place for 10 years, then he moved up on top of another pillar. This time it was a bigger one up on Wondrous Mountain. And he lived there 45 years, the rest of his life, on that pillar, praying to God. He became a wonder worker, a miracle worker. People came from all over the place. And here's what's amazing. So as his reputation spread as a prayerful man, a saint, as a wonder worker, then also the number of pilgrims began to increase. And what happened was, as people would come, and there was no place to stay in this dry and rocky place, and so somebody built a guest house, and then somebody else built I think they called it some kind of a refreshment center or something. Again, think 1,500 years ago. I don't know what that would have looked like. And then someone built a chapel, and then someone built a monastery. And so this dry and rocky place goes from being a dry and rocky kind of desolate place to this place of pilgrimage, now known as Wondrous Mountain. It's fascinating. Anyway, this brings me to the second half of this video, and that is a story I thought about, something that happened with my dear friend, Father Basil, and I when we were in Alaska. He was Reader Basil at the time. I was just plain old Peter. And we lived up there, and we lived in this house that had 26 people in it. It was a wonderful place. The priest and his family lived there, and there were a bunch of college-age people living there, and the idea was to try to really grow closer to God in this community, and it was a great experience for a year. I loved it. But one of the difficulties was that there was no place to pray. I mean, there was just no quiet spot, and so because there were so many people under one roof. So Father Basil and I were lamenting this one day, and we decided that, like the saints of old, we were going to go find a cave, and we'd go pray in a cave. So we thought, it's Alaska, there must be a lot of caves here. So we went out and we hiked down this big, huge ravine, and we get to the bottom. We thought, this is a perfect place for a cave. And we looked everywhere, and we exhausted our search. We couldn't find a cave anywhere. We were sure this was supposed to be here for us, this cave. We had this honorable desire to pray in silence, and yet this cave was not there. So we thought, what is going on here? Maybe this isn't God's will for us to find a cave. All of a sudden, we hear a branch breaking overhead. And we look up, and there's this huge, great horned owl flying over. I mean, really high up, I don't know, 50, 60 feet. And the sound that we heard was a tree branch breaking. This owl was so big, when it hit this branch, then the branch snapped off the tree. It wasn't this big around, it was a little branch, but still, it snapped off the tree and came falling down above our heads. Father Basil says, "Run, go chase that owl. He'll show us where the cave is," right? So we're having a lot of fun. And we run off through this valley, and we're running as fast as we can go. And it was like Peter and John running to the tomb. You know, I was the younger one, so I got there first. And we get out there, and we're to where we could no longer see the owl, and I hear Father Basil saying, "Look around, it's got to be here somewhere." So we're looking around, we look everywhere, and we look here and there, and there was no cave. I said, "I can't believe this." He says, "This can't be right. That had to be it, and the owl was going to show us the cave." So I all of a sudden I look down, and I look around me, and I look in front of me onto the hillside that I'm facing, and I see this kind of an archway in the hillside. I'm like, what is that? I kind of step away from it, and I look, and I realize that a long time ago a tree had fallen over, and the root system had kind of strained over like this. And I kind of reached my hand in under those roots, and I started digging, and the dirt was really loose. I looked at Father Basil, he looked at me, and I said, "Are you thinking what I'm thinking?" He said, "Yeah." I said, "Let's get a shovel." So we went up, and we got a shovel, and we dug it out. And we created this cave beneath this root system of this fallen tree, put a door on it, and we called it the Chapel of St. John Maximovich. You know, it was, you could fit like 6 people in there. It was wonderful. So it wasn't a rock cave, but it was a cave of dirt made from some old tree roots. Anyway, the reason I tell you the story, other than the fact that it's a fun story and I like telling stories, is I was thinking about St. Symeon. He made me think of this, you know, with his story, that he went out and he lived in a dry and rocky place where nobody was. It was a deserted place. Nobody really wanted to be there. But because of his devotion to Christ, and because of the things that he did in that place, his prayerfulness and his miracle working, his fasting, his acts of asceticism, you know, his devotion to Christ, he transformed that place from being a dry and rocky place to being known as Wondrous Mountain, to being the site of a great monastery, to being the site of a chapel, to being a place of pilgrimage. And so I'd like each of us to look at our own life, where we are. You know, you might live in an apartment in the middle of the city, and perhaps if that's the case, maybe the only cave that you can go into is the closet of your heart, so to speak, and that's fine. Jesus talks about that, of course. But then there's also that other question of, what is it that we're going to transform, given these years that we have on this planet? What are we going to transform? What are we going to work with God to transfigure? Hopefully beginning with ourselves, that we will co-labor with God to go from being sinners to being saints, by the grace of God, pouring of the Holy Spirit. But then that also we would take this time to make beautiful things out of things that perhaps aren't beautiful. Perhaps we take a dry and rocky place, and working with God, we make it into something wondrous. Christ is risen. Indeed, he is risen.